All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Hot Topics in the Heat of Summer. I'm Brett Norton from Beyond Clean. I'd like to give a special thanks to our event sponsor, 3M, for supporting today's educational event. Their dedication to your education is what helped make today's event possible. I would also like to thank CBSPD for collaborating with us for a two-part Global Sterile Processing Conference series. Bob Straub is the Director of Field Sales and Business Development at Centerin. With over 20 years of experience in sales and clinical education and training, Bob is a dedicated industry educator who strives to provide easily accessible educational opportunities to frontline healthcare professionals. Bob's passion for education can be seen in the healthcare seminars he conducts not only throughout the U.S., but internationally as well. Today, Bob is going to shed some light on the importance of proper drying of complex medical devices, specifically robotic devices. Discover firsthand how implementing a standardized drying method into your department's workflow will provide consistency in the drying of these complex devices. You'll be glad you turned into this session. So let's welcome Bob, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Brett, so much. I appreciate the introduction. And again, I want to just reiterate what Brett had just mentioned. I want to thank Beyond Clean for providing such a great virtual education conference. As Brett mentioned, I've been in the sterile processing world for most of my entire career. A lot of that in bringing forth a lot of different solutions to customers throughout the world, and one of which, a passion of mine, has been education. So really appreciate the opportunity that Beyond Clean is allowing us to speak today, as well as thanking 3M for sponsoring the event, and also thanking CCI and CBSPD. So again, thanks to everybody for sponsoring this event and allowing this platform to continue. But I want to also thank you, the attendees who are here today. You know, I've been very fortunate in my career to meet a lot of sterile processing professionals, not just here in the United States, but throughout the world. Your dedication, skills, and talent provide incredible value to not only your hospitals where you work, but the communities where you live. I know many departments right now have been short-staffed. So for those of you who are working today, and your team leaders and managers, thank you so much for everything that you do. We know that it's been difficult times for many departments. You're showing up every day, and not just showing up, but providing those skills and talents each and every day to provide safe outcomes for the patients in your facilities is not only appreciated, but we are grateful that we have such a dedicated group that we call sterile processing professionals, as well as your commitment to further education. Knowledge sharing and education is what improves processes. And those process improvements lead to better outcomes for patients, as well as better confidence in the processes that you provide. So again, thanks for being here. I really appreciate everybody's efforts ongoing, especially the past year and a half and moving forward. So let's talk about what we're going to speak about today. We're going to talk about a subject near and dear to my heart, and that is called drying medical devices. The principles behind it, the science behind drying medical devices. Take a look at some of the industry guidelines regarding drying medical devices. Some of the challenges that lumen devices, complex devices, can present relative to drying, specifically robotic devices, as well as other lumen devices. And we're going to list the current methods for drying those devices and some of those advantages and limitations. You know, medical device drying is an extremely important infection prevention function in the reprocessing loop. Evidence-based research has reinforced the risks, and standards support its importance. Dryness is a concept that challenges many sterile processing professionals. It's a particular concern in healthcare facilities because residual moisture can inhibit the sterilization process and because it provides a potential conduit for contamination in sterilized packs and inside device channels. Now, we as consumers, we recognize dry every single day, right? whether it's clothes drying on a line, or flowers being dried, or certainly the weather that has produced so much dryness in many parts of the United States this year, in the western area. As also, as we recognize dry in kind of a humorous way with that dry humor, such as the door is alarmed. Well, what startled it? So dryness is part of our everyday as far as consumers, but it also has meaning when it comes to devices within our departments. These devices that you see have one thing in common prior to the next step in processing, and that is those devices need to be rendered dry prior to the next step. So we're going to talk about that today and how do we do that, accomplish that, and some techniques that you can use, as well as how do you assess the department that you have relative to drying and some needs that you may have. Now, why is drying important? Well, we all know what can happen to damp clothing if not dried within a certain period of time, right? It gets kind of stinky. Well, why is that? Because mildew can start growing on the clothes or towels, etc., and they begin to develop and cause that odor. Well, processes can happen with medical devices as well. They can begin to form biofilm, as well as other negative consequences that can happen. Moisture, whether it appears on a towel or the exterior of a medical device, is pretty easy to spot. Yeah, you can see it, right? But what happens about the surfaces of the device that you can't see? Those internal parts of the device, lumens, and other areas of the device. So today, we're going to spend a little time speaking about just that. Moisture on the interior of devices, its consequences, and tools and techniques you can use to help reduce the likelihood of negative consequences. Well, there's science behind drying medical devices. In fact, this is a science that's been well known for a long time as far as dryness. As you can see, there's 4 principles relative to drying a medical device. These 4 principles work hand in hand to reduce moisture and render items dry. So you apply these 4 principles each and every day. Now, you may not realize it, but you are applying these principles regularly. How do you remove visible moisture from a device? Well, you can use lint-free towels, compressed air, placing devices in a drying cabinet. Well, they aid in evaporating moisture through air movement and temperature control. And don't forget, the humidity in your department is controlled to reduce moisture content in the environment itself. So today is about, like I said, providing some insights in order for you to give more conscious thought and consideration to a critical component within your world. Applying these principles to drying lumen devices, such as robotic devices, will provide you the opportunity to deliver items to the OR knowing they are dry. And why is that important? Well, at the end of the day, isn't it all about patient safety? That's why we're here. So drying devices is as important as other parts of your process because they all can impact patient safety. Just with other parts of sterile processing and protocols, there's vocabulary relative to drying. Well, pretty simple, right? Drying basically dehydrates or removes moisture from a surface, and this simple action inhibits the growth of bacteria. Pretty simple. But there's other words involved as well. So, example of conductive heat would be a steam sterilizer. Your sterilizers are continuously conducting heat to dry items at the end of the load, at the end of the cycle. Drying cabinets also would provide convection drying, which provide uniform heating and drying to a surface. So when you place devices in the drying cabinet that may be in your department, you'll notice warm air being circulated through the cabinet. And that's what we call convection drying. So drying itself does have some vocabulary that we should all be familiar with so that we can make decisions relative to how devices are dry and what's the science behind those terms. Also, evaporation. Pretty simple. Evaporation, when water is heated, it evaporates. And just like the picture on the screen shows you, that's what occurs. But it really occurs when there is air movement and temperature. Examples, again, would be a drying cabinet that you may have in your department using convection, right? We spoke about that, and mechanical airflow through a lumen device to help evaporate the moisture that may be in those internal components. Like I said, drying is rather simple. Just need to implement a few simple yet effective methods and know the vocabulary as we move forward. So how do you apply the 4 principles of drying every day? So here are a few tasks that you and your team do each and every day. Each of them have their own advantages and limitations. Attempting to achieve a dry state for lumens by allowing them to simply air dry will take considerable time. Why? Because again, think about that lumen. It's in a dark place inside, and just having air dry from the environment is going to take that a very long time. It could take possibly days to actually dry that lumen. Well, again, think about that lumen and where it's located and how just by letting it air dry is going to dry effectively. And what would that mean for bacterial recontamination within that lumen device itself? Mechanical drying, such as drying cabinets, can certainly speed up the process and provides uniform heating and drying, hence inhibiting bacterial recontamination. Drying cabinets do come at a cost though, right? Dollars in real estate. They're going to cost money and they're going to take up space, but usually an excellent cost-effective investment to render devices dry. So some of you, may be air drying devices. There's advantages and disadvantages with that. Towel drying, again, always using a non-lint towel to absorb moisture from the surface of devices, certainly the exterior of a device. And the mechanical drying typically comes in the form of drying cabinets. So let's take a closer look at some of these techniques. As far as air drying devices, the exteriors of these devices, as you can see on the screen, will certainly air dry over a given period of time. There's no question about that. But you've probably noticed water dripping from them after they've gone through a sonic washer or automated washer. So how will simply air drying them evaporate moisture remaining inside? You're going to have to rely on conductive drying, which is basically temperature coming through the lumens, but that's going to take a very, very long time. And you don't know how long that time is going to take. Again, air drying doesn't cost anything, but is that good enough for the lumen devices? Is that good enough for the internal parts of scopes, robotic devices, etc.? Towel drying, again, also has some advantages. Simple, effective for absorbing moisture on the exterior of devices. And you do that each and every day with some of the devices that are in your department. But again, towel drying internal channels, that's just not possible, right? Because some of those ports and lumens are so small. So towel drying really is meant for the exterior devices only. And as I mentioned, mechanical drying. Removing moisture with heat or forced air from devices and or lumens. So mechanical drying can enhance drying of surfaces and lumens by directing warm air around devices or through devices if that is accompanied with it. The compressed air you have in your department, the compressed air that you use in your department is an example of mechanical drying. You know, we've all used sometimes those compressors with the nozzles at the end of it. That is a form of mechanical drying. Most effective for simply reducing moisture inside a lumen, but not great for drying. So in other words, they can remove a lot of that residual water that may be located within a lumen device, robotic device, or a scope, but not very good for actually rendering the device dry itself. Because it's a manual process, remember that? And depending on the device, may not also be able to attach it securely. So when you place that air gun compressor on a device, it's 100% manually. And if you don't place it on there correctly, may not be able to blow all that water out of there. And certainly it's not going to just dry if it's a lumen device, again, just waiting for conductive drying to take over. Also, even though it provides a burst of air, it's not consistent or constant. It's just a burst of air, and it will not thoroughly dry the lumens that are inside those devices. Air movement works best when it's constant, consistent, warmed, and at the right pressure. And pressure is another thing to consider when using air compressed air onto lumens to make sure that you're using the pressure that's rated for that device itself. Now, you may have independent air pumps that are optional, that may be in drying cabinets, that can dry tubing, long lumens, et cetera, such as endoscope channels. So mechanical drying certainly speeds up the process. It can be very effective because it's not only circulating air through internal components, but it's also warming the air. And it goes right back to that term we spoke about earlier, evaporation. And that will speed up the evaporation of moisture to dry the surface itself, especially those internal surfaces. Now, which method to choose and why? Well, we always want to refer to the manufacturer's instructions for use, IFUs. That starts with everything, right? They'll give you guidance in terms of providing guides focused on recommended practices and how to dry a device, focused again on the ability to achieve desired outcomes. And again, just with other processes in sterile processing departments, you always want to check with the device manufacturer regarding those instructions. If mechanical drying is used and is listed, the IFU can direct you regarding temperature, amount of time necessarily, etc. So always, just like with any other process in sterile processing, check with the IFU of the manufacturer, and they'll give you guidance and recommendations relative to how to dry a specific device, as far as how long and temperature ranges as well. So again, drying in IFUs, in addition, a manufacturer may recommend several methods for drying a device, and you can determine which methods are best for your department. So again, always start with your IFU, and they'll let you know relative to drying times, if those are listed, as well as there's any temperature limitations, especially if you're using a mechanical drying process such as a drying cabinet for scopes and other materials that may have temperature limitations. Refer to those IFUs for what those temperature specifications are for that specific device. So what's the big deal relative to drying? Well, so what are we chatting all about? All of this vocabulary, conduction, convection, evaporation, mechanical drying, all of these issues. Because all of this applies to being able to successfully and consistently dry lumen instruments, such as robotic devices and scopes and other devices in your department. Robotic devices, as you know, are very high-profile devices, and they're expensive, and they do amazing things. They help surgeons do those amazing things each and every day in your facilities. They provide real benefits to patients and patient outcomes, and we need to make sure we are providing the necessary resources when processing those devices, including drying. All right, let's take a break, have a little dry humor, right, since we're speaking about dry all day. So did you know that the first French fries weren't actually cooked in France? They were actually cooked in Greece, right? So a little dry humor before we get going. All right, so as we move along, so what about drying today in SPD? Well, just like you see on the screen, unfortunately, there's no universal test for dryness today at this time, in part because of the complexity of assessing it. Think about all the different devices, internal components, channels, lumens, etc., and because there's been very few drying studies. There also have been very little oversight relative to instrument drying in the industry as a whole, which has created less urgency to establish a standard. And hopefully, as things move on and progress, drying standards can be established just like other standards have been established in SPD. However, in an attempt to reduce infection rates, more regulatory attention is being paid to the sterile processing environment, as we all know, and to thorough drying. We read articles a lot over the past year or two relative to drying flexible scopes and the importance of that. So again, making sure those manufacturers' instructions are followed and used as an essential element of the infection prevention chain of control. So drying is just as important as washing, just as important as other parts of the process itself, and because we all want to reduce those potential infection rates. But right now, there just has not been a lot of tests relative to drying. There have not been a lot of studies relative to drying. But moving forward, that is beginning to change to give you more research that you can follow, more guidelines and recommended practices, which then will spin off more tools and processes relative to drying. Now, drying is, as I mentioned, a critical part as it relates to sterilization. It absolutely is. Drying needs to be a conscious part of sterile processing, just like washing, just like sterilization, and other processes. No different than washing or sterilization. It has been sometimes kind of an overlooked part of the process. And if you think about it, during the day you're busy. Those of you who have drying cabinets, placing devices in there, trays, containers, items in your drying cabinets, opening and closing the doors all day, they become kind of second nature and just kind of part of the environment, right? But we want to make sure that we're giving conscious thought to those intricate, complex devices. Are they truly dry? How are they being dried? Just like we do with washing and sterilization. Because just like the slide says, failure to dry an instrument thoroughly may impede sterilization or disinfection processes that are to follow. Steam sterilization, right? They use water vapor, steam to sterilize devices. So what's the big deal with drying prior to steam sterilization? Well, even the smallest amount of moisture can affect the quality of the steam. So just as Amy ST79 mentions, excess moisture can lead to wet packs that supply a pathway for microbial invasion into the pack and can also lead to device corrosion. So that's why it's critical that devices, even before they're going into steam sterilization, are dry. And you'll see that throughout manufacturers' instructions for use, whether they're for robotic devices or other devices, that they're to be dry prior to steam sterilization. But it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. There hasn't been a lot of studies relative to dry. There haven't been any universal tests relative to dry. But there are tools and techniques that we can all implement and apply to assure us that the device that we're placing in steam sterilizers are in fact dry. So we're going to talk about that as well a little bit later on. And again, in addition, the sterilizer could experience condensation issues relative to moisture if there's moisture in the load prior to the sterilization process starting. So if you want instruments to be dry at the end of the sterilization process, then they need to be dry at the beginning of the sterilization process. So if you want something dry at the end of the sterilization process, I know those devices that can be intricate, complex, making sure they're dry. If you want those to be dry at the end of the process, let's make sure that they're dry at the beginning of the sterilization process. Now, here's some additional reasons why devices need to be dry. So, the state of dry has a lot of benefits, which all relate to patient safety, no question about it. Improper drying can also cause water damage on devices. This can lead to discoloration, corrosion, rust, and pitting, making equipment unusable. So again, water, it's great for washing, right? Great for the ultrasonic cleaners, great for the washers. But we don't want that water to remain on devices because it can also cause issue with those devices itself. And another topic, biofilm. Biofilm can be doubly worrying as the bacteria within it can be very resistant to antibiotics and disinfectants, meaning they are harder to control than free-forming or free-floating bacteria. So there's a lot of reasons why devices need to be dry. Patient safety, absolutely number one, but preventing rust, reducing bacterial contamination, and reducing the ability for biofilm to form on devices. Well, what about low temperature sterilization processes? Why do devices need to be dry going into the low temperature sterilizer? Well, presence of moisture in the lumens, for instance, could lead to aborted loads because that device, that low temperature sterilizer, may not be able to pull as low of a vacuum that's necessary for that cycle to continue, which will cause delays in the cycle or in the process itself, additional costs. You may have to cancel the cycle when it aborts and then start over again. So we want to make sure that even for the low temperature sterilizers, that devices are dry. And again, refer to Amy ST58. They'll give you a lot of information relative to low temperature sterilization, processing, and why devices need to be dry as well throughout that process. So what's the cost of not adequately drying devices? Well, certainly increased time, which causes delays. So the more time that we have to increase and repeat processes, think about departments right now that might be short-staffed, and then having to increase those processes for whether something's not dry or another consequence that may have occurred. Again, delays, increased labor, and potentially not having available inventory. So, and again, it goes back to, as I mentioned previously, the cost also comes down to bacterial recontamination as well as safety risks. So putting together some thoughtful, conscious processes relative to drying your devices can help reduce some of these issues that could possibly occur and the negative consequences that it could also mean. So we want to try to make sure the folks who are in the department are being used efficiently, effectively, not having to redo processes and repeat processes so that we're saving time and money and affecting and impacting ultimately patient care. Now, what have you experienced relative to drying devices in your department? I speak to a lot of sterile processing professionals throughout the country, and it's something that they would like to give some more conscious effort towards and to have more tools at the ready, as well as more studies and research being done relative to drying so that they can have more of a conscious and effort relative to drying, just like they do with other parts of the process. So think about, in your experiences, what you have encountered when devices aren't dry, or how long that they take, or is there another way, a new way to do these types of things as far as drying lumen devices and internal channels and internal components? So think about that. Meet with your teams, talk about what they're doing today. Are we just air drying devices? Are we using lint-free towels relative to removing moisture? Are we looking at the air compressors to make sure that the pressure is set correctly and that the nozzles are fitting on correctly relative to lumen devices? So think about those things. Talk to your teams about that so you can begin assessing your drying needs within your department and coming up with a different approach, more conscious approach to drying itself. Now, a word or two about air. So we can't talk about drying without bringing up one of my favorite topics relative to drying, and that is air. Having good quality air is important for safe reprocessing. So we'll talk a little bit about HEPA filters, and we'll talk about pre-filters and things like that that are used every day. You don't even know that they exist, but they're working for you to provide good quality air for your department relative to drying cabinets and the overall environment itself. Obviously, your department air is monitored for the appropriate air exchanges that is recommended by AAMI guidelines. So that is part of the AAMI standards to make sure that the air exchangers are being are appropriate and being monitored on a regular basis by your facilities folks, because that air that's coming in your department is air drying those devices that are on the clean side. In addition, many departments might be equipped with drying cabinets and other devices to provide air to lumens and other components of your devices. So when you take a look at your drying cabinet, the air filter, the air that will enter the cabinet first, goes through a pre-filter and then through a HEPA filter. The pre-filter is in place to act as the first line of defense to filtrate particulates in the air. So I can't stress enough a couple of things relative to those filters. Follow your drying cabinet's IFU, their instructions for use, for appropriate filter replacement intervals. So that filter may not be completely obvious to you on a regular basis. Check your manuals where it's located, find out where it is, and then act accordingly based on your drying cabinet IFU relative to replacement intervals for those filters. If you aren't familiar, then you, again, refer to your user manual and/or contact your drying cabinet manufacturer for further information. So that air is first coming through that pre-filter. So it's filtrating out all those large particulates before it goes into the HEPA filter. So sometimes those filters need to be changed once a month, twice a month, etc., but they're there to work for you. So pay attention to where they're located, take a look at your drying cabinet IFU, and replace accordingly. Make sure you have enough air filters on hand so you can replace them when you need to. Now, what about the HEPA filters that may be either in a drying cabinet or another device within your department? You know, HEPA filter is an acronym for high efficiency particulate air. This type of filter can remove at least 99.97% of dust, pollen, mold, and bacteria, and any airborne particulates with a size of 0.3 microns. These work for you every single day. When you're in your department, those cabinets are just, drying your devices. That HEPA filter is providing that clean air for within your cabinet throughout your shift. All air cleaners, though, require, periodic cleaning and filter changes. So again, just like with the pre-filters, that is the first line of defense, the HEPA filter also needs to have regular maintenance. Typically, you'll see, if you check your device cabinet manufacturer's IFU for the frequency of changing that HEPA filter. Typically, it's annually, once a year. It's something that the pre-filter can be changed most of the time by end users. They're usually pretty accessible for end users. The HEPA filter more than likely is going to require maintenance facility folks to come down to your department and replace that filters. Okay, so again, make sure that you're taking a look at both the filters in your drying cabinets and other devices. There may be other devices that you're using to blow out air or to dry devices that may have a HEPA filter. Make sure that you're checking the IFU from that manufacturer to make sure that HEPA filter is replaced appropriately so it's working for you. Those two filters work hand in hand to provide that clean air that's within your drying cabinet or other devices that have HEPA filters. So make sure that you follow accordingly and change those filters when you're supposed to. Hey, before we move on, a couple of things. There's a few songs actually with the title "Dry" in it. And these are the top 5 songs in history that have been big sellers with the title "Dry" in it. Tears dry on their own. Well, medical devices don't dry on their own, though, do they? Cry tears until my tears run dry, home and dry till your well runs dry, and dry spell. Amy Winehouse, the late Amy, great late Amy Winehouse, she sung and wrote the song "Tears Dry on Their Own," and Linda Ronstadt, she sung and wrote the second song, "Cry Till My Tears Run Dry." So the word "dry" we use that every day, right? And we as consumers, etc. So just a little trivia around drying. All right, so how does all this information apply then to lumen devices? We've talked about convection, we've talked about air movement, evaporation, HEPA filters, airflow, all of those types of topics. So how does all this then apply to drying lumen devices? Well, think about those reusable robotic devices. Oops, let me go back one slide. Think about those reusable robotic devices with lumens. They're in widespread use for minimally invasive procedures and surgeries in the US and around the world. And they do great, great things for surgeons and for patients. Lumen devices, though, do pose a significant drying challenge during reprocessing. For these reasons, and because thorough drying is a requirement of the reprocessing instructions for use, we want to pay some close attention to how we are going about drying these types of devices. So let's talk about that a little bit more. What, in fact, are lumens? Well, lumens are basically tubing technology, right? That's what they are. Sophisticated devices. Some of them have very narrow inner diameters, and some of them pass air, fluid, and mechanics through them to provide either therapeutic, diagnostic processes during the procedures. But they can be very narrow. They are pretty sophisticated if you think about some of those right turns and angles that they have to make. But basically, it's tubing technology. Now, those narrow lumen instruments and endoscopes can be one of your biggest challenges as far as reprocessing, not just drying, but also making sure that they're cleaned properly and sterilized. You know, whether you're brushing, flushing, washing, or drying, they can present challenges. And they are inside the devices, limiting visual verification of processing, including drying. Great news that the industry is moving towards using the borescopes to take a look down lumen devices to see what's in there as far as any debris that's left, et cetera. That's where the processes need to start moving forward with those types of devices so that you can see inside those lumens. And here you see on the screen what it looks like when there is residual moisture and potential waterborne pathogens present inside a lumen. Bacteria can be attached to those droplets of moisture that settle on the interior surface of a lumen device. So let's talk about what we've learned so far relative to this lumen device. How do we apply those 4 principles? Can you air dry a lumen? Well, since lumens are interior surfaces, that won't work very well, will it? Simply setting devices aside and thinking that they will dry on their own just with air drying within a reasonable time frame won't work too well for your processes. It may take a long time. Earlier we spoke about towel drying devices as well. Well, not so good for lumen devices. So what we have to do is the ability to use mechanical drying techniques to evaporate moisture. We talked about evaporation, and reduce the known adverse consequences of moisture. So if you take a look at those lumens and those water droplets, we're going to need to affect something so that they dry. Just drying on their own, air drying is just not going to dry those in a very short period of time. It could take hours or days to render those lumens truly dry. So let's take a look at some of the robotic devices, made by Intuitive Surgical, who makes just fantastic devices, as I mentioned, for robotic surgery. First, robotic surgery, again, like I said, provides so many benefits for surgeons and patients. This advanced technology continues to provide those benefits throughout the world and undoubtedly will expand as the technology expands. They do great things. As you know, processing robotic devices are supported by the Intuitive manufacturer's IFUs. And as you can see for the SI model, as well as the XI model, there is a base and shaft, which are processed during flushing, rinsing, cleaning, and sterilization. And as with all devices containing lumens, special attention via the IFU to processing is critical in providing the desired outcome of clean and sterilized. And here's kind of the process flow for processing robotic devices. The process flow from the manufacturer looks like this. It's a very thoughtful, deliberate process for achieving desired results. What you see on the screen is a series of events which take place for each processing event for robotic devices from end to end. And you do this every day. These are really critical steps to make sure that the devices are soaked, flushed, sprayed, all those types of things. Ultrasonic cleaning's involved. Again, that they're dried, inspected, lubricated, wrapped, packed, and go through the steam sterilizer. So these are steps that you're doing every single day. However, one step which we have been speaking about hasn't had the same amount of research and studies as many of the other steps that are located on this flowchart, and that is drying. So applying the principles of drying with the appropriate drying technique is important to achieve a clinically dry state. So we look at this, and we see the processing instructions for these devices: dry thoroughly, dry instruments with cloth, blow air, it's optional, ensure instrument is dry. Ensuring drying thoroughly, we've got to make sure we put a little bit of science behind that. What does that mean, okay? Drying instruments with a cloth will certainly meet one of the principles of drying, using a towel, no doubt about it, but what about the lumens and the internal components? Ensuring the instrument is dry, certainly you can see the exterior is dry, but what about the interior? The shaft of the device, the lumens, the base of the device with its internal components. So just as we previously mentioned, in order for devices to be dry at the end of the sterilization process, they need to be dry at the beginning of the process. As with a lot of processes and protocols within sterile processing, there's always opportunity for improvement, right? So they said it's, opportunities for improvement in quality control set a clinical standard and provide confidence that the protocols in use help to mitigate as much as possible the risk of contamination, and drying falls right into that. Reducing variability, providing consistency in order to improve quality systems is always part of the goal. So recently, there were about over 1,000 hospitals surveyed relative to drying robotic devices, and here's what came out of the survey. About 40% air dry or towel dry, both those devices. About 30% use compressed air plus drying with air, just the air drying. And the time for compressed air varied, ranging from 1 second to 60 seconds. There was really no standard. And about 25% of those who were surveyed used compressed air plus a drying cabinet. So again, the time for compressed air is about the same as above. There was really no standard in terms of how long they used compressed air to remove that, first residual water out of the robotic devices. And the time and orientation in the cabinet as well varied. There was no standard. And about 5% did not know how they were drying those devices. So let's talk about some of these methods. Using compressed air certainly can remove the excess water from these devices, but on its own, it's not going to dry those devices because it's not constant, it's not consistent. It's typically just a burst of air at first when removing that residual water. And just allowing the devices to air dry, just kind of positioning them on shelving. Certainly the exterior will air dry these devices, but there's no lumen drying capability. And if you take a look by just placing some of these devices that we spoke about, very high profile devices, very expensive devices, just putting them on a shelf and letting them air dry, there's a potential for damage, isn't there? By potentially either placing too many upon themselves, or maybe one of them falls off, or another device is placed on them. So again, just allowing them to air dry is not going to do much relative to the lumen that's inside there. Here's something else that I've seen with some hospitals, is positioning the devices inside a drying cabinet, which is terrific to do because certainly they'll dry through convection. But if you take a look at the ceiling of this picture of the drying cabinet, that's a tube drying rack. That's really intended for larger bore, larger lumen devices, such as it comes from respiratory or anesthesia. And the air that can flow through there, in this picture, the ports are on the other end. So air is not flowing through any of those shafts at all that you see there. And again, another potential for damage if those devices slip out of there. So those tube drying racks are really intended for larger bore tubing that may come from respiratory, anesthesia, etc. And again, another photo of just leaning them against the cabinet wall of a drying cabinet, no air that's being flowed through the devices, and again, waiting for convection to do its job, which may take a long time. And again, potential damage by leaning them against the wall if they fall over. So as I mentioned, there's opportunities for improvement for all of these techniques relative to drying these devices. And again, those testing and tools and metrics, other critical sterile processing functions use those tools and testing to verify compliance. Drying just has not been there yet relative to, again, having those standards and tests available to make it reproducible, universally applicable relative to that, which is vital for patient safety. Process changes in SPD. Well, new solutions are brought to your department each and every year, aren't they? Whether it's automation, instrument tracking that's been the past 10 or 15 years, better concentrated detergents for washing, automated flushing of lumen devices, low temperature sterilization. All of these processes and changes have been brought by industry experts to help provide solutions, answers, and efficiencies within your department that will all lead to better patient outcomes. Now, there has been a recent study relative to robotic devices and drying those devices. This study was commissioned to determine the effectiveness of a novel lumen drying system and its directed airflow process for drying reusable medical device lumens, such as robotic devices. The study assessed whether the internal channel surfaces of robotic arms connected to the system reached a consistent, measurable standard of dryness in a predetermined amount of time. The objectives were to scientifically qualify what is clinically dry and what's not dry, and develop a static metric that can be applied relative to clinically dry, and determine if a directed airflow process of a novel lumen drying unit has a measurable effect on reaching that clinically dry state. Again, putting some science behind drying with metrics so that you're assured that those devices can, in fact, be dry. The study itself had two phases. Phase one was to basically develop a clinical dry benchmark. There were 385 Da Vinci EndoWrist devices tested, all part of this facility's inventory, and testing a novel drying system's effectiveness was phase two to achieve its benchmark. So basically what happened was that all the devices were weighed, their dry weight, which was then measured against the instructions for use as far as the manufacturer's specifications dry weight, to determine what the dry weight are of each of the 385 EndoWrists that are part of this facility's inventory. Second process was they determined the length of time the devices should be exposed to that pressurized air, right? So as I mentioned during the survey, people were using pressurized air from 1 second to 60 seconds. So what the study did, the authors in the study did, was to use pressurized air and develop a repeatable compliant process. So they used pressurized air for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and 30 seconds. And then they weighed all of the arms again after each of those time intervals. So they weighed the very sensitive weight scale to determine if there's any moisture left in those arms after using compressed air for 10 seconds, for 15 seconds, and then for 30 seconds to help, again, produce that benchmark and to see, how much water was left in those devices. Then after that, the data strongly indicates that there is a direct correlation between pressure-regulated air, exposure time, and the efficacy of the lumen drying system itself. During this phase, they were also developed a testing protocol to verify compliance with the exposure time that could be executed on the clean side itself. The verification protocol proved to have an almost 98% accuracy. So after they went through the air drying with the air gun, with the compressed air, Then they attached these to this new lumen drying process. And what they found was the combination of using compressed air for 30 seconds and this new novel lumen drying product for 30 minutes is what then came out 98% dry once they reweighed all of the arms themselves. So again, developing standardized, metric-produced processes to help you know when a device is in fact dry. So the results, basically, the study has shown that this new directed air system and the protocol developed for testing its efficacy provide an opportunity for facilities to achieve numerous clinical benefits. The study supports the conclusion that this is a reproducible protocol that can result in significant cost savings, improve reprocessing productivity for lumen instruments, and increase assurance in the sterile processing workflow. Again, that new metric of using this new device for 30 seconds and 30 minutes became clinically dry based on the testing that this study undertook. And again, there's a lot of benefits, again, to have those devices being in fact dry. It can also save a lot of time, and in this case, save as much as an hour less of drying time per cycle. This time savings can reduce processing time for these devices by overall by as much as 40%. In addition, the devices are positioned properly and secured in the system itself, protecting them from potential damage. So the novel lumen drying system positioned in a drying cabinet orients the arms properly. They're in the cabinet, positioned properly, and protected from any potential damage. As well as they can dry up to 10 lumens at a time and reduce the number of OR reported retained moisture events, which can also improve surgical customer satisfaction. There was a 95% reduction in the number of OR reported retained moisture events through this study. The most important benefit, obviously, is patient safety, the potential for dramatically reducing a facility's risk of releasing contaminated lumen instruments. So when you're taking a look at drying in your department, consider some of these things, whether it's the robotic devices, other lumen devices. Is the drying technology optimal for those robotic devices? What type of research or study validates the process? Is the technology easy and repeatable? Is the technology also adaptable to other lumen devices? So can it dry robotic devices? Can it dry also other lumen devices? And also consider not simply relying on a quick burst of compressed air to dry your devices, including a direct and consistent airflow through your lumen devices, and reducing the potential damage that may occur if those devices are just lying around on shelves. And making sure that the devices themselves are oriented properly during the drying phase. There's lots of options for lumen drying that you may have purchased or are using in your department, whether it's drying cabinets, air guns, other lumen drying devices for scopes, as well as a new lumen drying device itself. So it's all about reducing the risk, making sure that those water droplets that you see in those lumen devices are mitigating that risk to remove them, evaporate them, so that before they go into steam sterilizers and or low temperature sterilization, those lumens are in fact dry. So it's all about reducing that risk and making sure that patient safety obviously is even more enhanced with what you're doing. Anyway, I want to thank you all. I know it's a lot of information, but I want you to urge you all to stay safe and stay dry. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Bob, thank you. That was a really informative and timely presentation. I was actually at a sterile processing department just this week visiting and talking with the manager and education director, and they discussed the challenges that they faced with finding space, even though it's a newer department, for drying cabinets. And sure. knowing that there was an emphasis on and making sure that the instruments, especially the robotics and scopes, had some sort of device or a cabinet to dry these various devices. They just didn't have any input at the beginning to where there could be actual space to,
sure.
So that's another challenge that a lot of these departments face.
It is, real estate is, the real estate is what it is. There's lots of different ways to look at the real estate departments, just like what they do with washers and sterilizers. Drying cabinets can also be pass-throughs. That's part of the flow, or they can be simply standalone on the clean side. Cabinets themselves can come in a lot of different sizes, small, medium, and large for some of the companies that provide. So space can be found. I think the key is to take a look at those really high-profile devices that are very expensive, and make sure that there is some, conscious effort relative to thinking about ways to dry them and coming up with some solutions for that, and looking at the department as far as its real estate and using it as efficiently as they can.
Right. Yeah. Good point. And I think also maybe employing some of the expertise with SPD managers if you're looking to do a remodel or a build out or even a new facility. I think that having that input is invaluable because they're the ones that are going to be working in the department. They're the ones that are going to be held to following these standards and making sure that our patients are safe. So
you're absolutely right, Brett. Drying cabinets have historically been kind of considered just part of the furniture, right?
Yep.
And but it's really, really critical relative to the overall process. So when planning new departments or renovations, et cetera, need to be really given the conscious thought relative to placement, use of drying cabinets, and other devices, just like with washers, sterilizers, whether steam or low temperature.
Right. Well, so with that said, why don't we get to a couple of questions? So we have quite a few here, some good ones. Can using the forced air for drying cause damage to the robotic devices?
That is a great question. So you want to make sure, as always, check with the manufacturer IFU. So the compressed, you also want to make sure that you're working with your facilities engineers in your hospital to make sure that the pressure that's coming either out of the tank or the wall is appropriate for the devices that you're attempting to blow air through. I know the novel lumen devicing that I discussed is a very low pressure device. It's only 5 psi from what they've told me. So it provides a very low pressure but constant pressure. But yes, that can be a challenge. But I encourage everybody to work with your facilities people to make sure the pressure that's either coming out of the wall or the tanks is appropriate and safe to use for the devices in your department.
Great answer. So to follow that up, and speaking of space and everything, and you mentioned this toward the end of your presentation with the various ways to dry lumen devices. But in your opinion, what is the most effective way to dry and clean robotic devices and even scopes? Yeah,
so again, we want to apply those basic concepts I spoke about. So we've got to really pay attention to the lumen and how we're going to direct airflow through there. There are devices that you can use that are outside of a drying cabinet for flexible scopes. There's also scope cabinets themselves that can be used for flexible scopes. For drying robotic devices, we want to make sure, obviously, we follow the manufacturer's IFU, but if there's the ability to enhance that IFU to really, again, provide something that's thoroughly dry, a consistent, low, constant air pressure of warmed air through that device is what's going to render it what the study termed clinically dry. After the bulk of the water is removed through an air compressor, used properly for 30 seconds, and then placed and attached to a lumen dryer that we spoke about in the study, 30 minutes later, the study proved that you would have a clinically dry robotic device.
Great point. So you mentioned IFUs, and there are IFUs out there that are not always very clear. What would your recommendations be for drying a device if it's not adequately specified in the IFU?
So again, you want to take a look at the device itself and apply some of these basics, right? Lumens, it's the tubing technology. It can be quite sophisticated. It can be quite delicate as far as materials. So what you don't want to do is just solely rely on compressed air that the air pressure may be too much, right? So again, you want to work with your facilities folks if that's what you're using as compressed air to maybe turn down that pressure to allow that lumen to at least be blown out of water without causing any damage. For flexible scopes, definitely follow the manufacturer's instructions for use. Those are long devices, much longer than the robotic devices. We want to make sure that the air flow is appropriate through the entire length of that flexible device, right? So that you can feel the air coming out of the end of that device, so that you can, you don't want that big burst of air, but you want that low, consistent air flow through there, being driven by low pressure. And again, I just encourage everyone to work with your facilities folks if you're using compressed air to make sure that it's dialed in at the right pressure level.
Great answer. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Is there a difference between medical air and instrument air?
There is. Instrument air has been used, obviously, in the OR as far as the grade of it. There is certain standards that, and I'd be glad to provide folks what these standards are if someone wants to email me relative to the differences. But there are specific standards relative to what makes something rendered medical air and what's something instrument air. These are typically standards that you'll find through industrial and fire codes, as well as other codes through state by state. Some of them do differ from state to state, but I'd be glad to provide anybody a copy of those if they're interested.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Bob. I think we're at time today, and I want to extend our sincere thanks for you taking your time out of your Friday to join us. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed talking to you in previous conversations, so looking forward to some more dialogue on that front, because there's a lot to be discussed on this for sure. So
looking forward to it, Brett.
Yeah, and so for everybody here, if we didn't get to any of the questions, which we did have a few that we didn't have time to get to, if you'd like to ask Bob, his contact information can be found in the speaker tool bio on the lower right of your screen. And we're just a little bit over time, but we've got about, I'd say, 13 minutes before our next session. And as a reminder, you can access the CE survey and certificate by visiting beyondclean.net/virtual events, and you will be automatically transferred to the survey page after the conference. All of today's sessions will be available on demand to share and view after the live session has concluded. Thank you again for joining us today, and we will see you in the next session.
Thank you, everyone.